There was never any connection in my mind between asking Carol Lam to resign and the public corruption case that her office was working on. I don't remember.
Just a coincidence that you sent that email saying, quote, the real problem we now have with Carol Lam that leads me to conclude that we should have someone ready to be nominated on 11/18, the day her 4-year term expires. Now, admittedly, that's sometime in the future, but if neither of those incidents was connected, what was the problem with Ms. Lam to ask her to resign?
The real problem at that time was her office's prosecution of immigration cases. In the month,
and that's the sole reason she was asked to resign?
No, sir. But at that time of that email, that's what was in my mind when I said the real problem with Carol Lam that leads me to believe that she should be asked to resign when her 4-year term expires. In my mind, that was immigration enforcement.
Let me move on.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall from TPM Media. It's Monday, May 14th, 2007. That was Kyle Sampson in his testimony a while back trying to explain that quote-unquote real problem email about Carol Lam, trying to explain why he wrote this email saying Lam should be fired just a day after she announced she was going to execute search warrants at CIA headquarters. Now, last week, Attorney General Alberto Gonzales came up to the Hill again for his second testimony. This was before the House Judiciary Committee. And a lot of people have commented that he seemed a lot more assured, a lot less worried about keeping his job in the most recent round of testimony. Now, I think there's a pretty straightforward reason for this. The President has made clear that it really doesn't matter how many lies the Attorney General is caught in, how many bad acts it seems like he committed. The President wants him to stay in his job. And I think it's clear that that's left Alberto Gonzales with a level of confidence that he's there to stay. What I want to get into, though, is the lack of questions in last Thursday's testimony, the lack of questions about the firing of Carol Lam. Now, there are a lot of different issues to get into about the firing story. We've talked a lot about the way that fake accusations of vote fraud played into probably at least half of the firings of U.S. attorneys. But the Lam firing has always, to my mind, been the most important, been the central one, because I believe it was about short-circuiting investigations of the CIA, Republicans on Capitol Hill, and I believe political appointees at the Pentagon as well. Now, we've already talked about that real problem email that Kyle Sampson sent late last year. But there's a couple other points that have come up more recently that I want to get into. Earlier this month, the House Judiciary Committee released written answers that the fired U.S. attorneys had submitted to the committee in response to queries. Now, one of those has to do with Carol Lam, and I want to look at it specifically. Lam speaks about her conversation with Michael Elston. He's the same guy who was making those threatening phone calls to other fired U.S. attorneys. She calls Elston. She's asking for a little more time to finish up a couple investigations. He tells her, it's not a matter of staying for a few more months. We want you gone in weeks. And then he says something very specific that I want to highlight. Elston told Lam these instructions, quote, were coming from the highest levels of the government. Now, a case like this, you've got to know a little bit about Washington speak and what that statement would be meant to mean. Coming from a high-level official at the Department of Justice, a statement like that, the highest levels of the government, that doesn't mean Alberto Gonzales. That doesn't mean the Deputy Attorney General. A statement like that means 3 or 4 people at the White House. The President, the Vice President, conceivably Karl Rove, possibly the President's Chief of Staff. That goes all the way to the top. People have not focused sufficiently on what Elston was saying. Have they followed up with Elston? Is Elston going to be called back up to Capitol Hill to answer about this? The highest levels of government. He's basically telling her this comes right from the President. Okay, point 2. We know that right before the real problem email, Carol Lam had notified the Justice Department that she was about to execute search warrants at CIA headquarters and later at the home of the number 3 official at the CIA. Now, even if you assume that everything at the Department of Justice was by the books, this is an unprecedented development. There's no question that this would have spawned a lot of emails within DOJ. Again, even if you assume everything was on the up and up, just emails discussing the proper way that this should be handled. Because again, it's so unprecedented. It brings in conceivably separation of powers issue. There's all sorts of questions about dealing with classified material at the CIA. In all the document dumps, there has been not one email with anybody at the Department of Justice discussing this, not one. So that makes it clear that we know that there are a lot of emails discussing Lam's prosecution, Lam's investigation, that have never been released. Why haven't we seen those? So, those two questions. When are we going to find out more about what Michael Elston was talking about when he said the order to fire Lam came from the very highest levels of the government? And two, what about all those emails? Emails discussing Lam's investigation, discussing her decision to execute those search warrants at CIA headquarters. They must exist, but we haven't seen them. When are the House and Senate Judiciary Committees going to start asking these two questions? I'm Josh Marshall from TPM Media, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.